For black men and women, slavery was an equally overwhelming experience. Both were torn from homeland and family. Both were forced to perform punishing labor, subjected to mental and physical abuse, and denied their most basic rights. Enslaved men and women were beaten, separated from their loved ones at random, and, regardless of sex, treated as property in the eyes of the law. Despite common factors, however, the circumstances of enslavement were different for black women and men. The first slaves to be brought to North America were mostly male. Considered more valuable workers because of their strength, enslaved men performed labors that ranged from building houses to plowing fields. Early on, slave buyers turned to purchasing female field hands, who were not only more available, but also less than male slaves. Because skilled labor such as carpentry and blacksmithing was assigned only to male slaves, the amount of black men available for agricultural work was reduced. As a result, the female slaves eventually outnumbered the men in the fields. In Africa, women's primary social role was that of mother. In slavery, this aspect of American womanhood was reduced. Where childbirth in Africa was a rite of passage for women that earned them increased admiration, within the American plantation system that developed by the mid-18th century, it was a cost-effective advantage for the slave master, who multiplied his labor force through slave and pregnancy. The average enslaved woman at this time gave birth to her first child at 19 years old, and thereafter bore one child every 2.5 years. This cycle, encouraged by the master, was not without benefits to the mother. While pregnant, she could usually expect more food and fewer working hours. Since proven fertility made her more important to her owners, she was also less likely to be sold away. Of course, the burdens, physical as well as psychological, that came with childbearing were enormous for enslaved women. Enslaved women were expected to put the needs of the master and his family before her own children. The slave mother on a large plantation returned to the field soon after giving birth, leaving her child to be raised by others. On smaller farms, the slave's mothering responsibilities were simply added on top of her usual duties. For the love of her children, slave mothers often chose to stay in bondage, while their male counterparts attempted to escape. The female slave was also faced with the possibility of being forced into sexual relationships for the purpose of reproduction. The master's control over both spouses reduced the black male's potential for dominance over his wife and family. Married slaves were not legally recognized and held no joint property in common. Also, the segregation of labor by sex and the frequency at which male slaves were sold meant women were not only left to raise their children alone, but also to rely on family friends and relations above husbands. It takes a village to raise a child, which is simply a recognition of how it used to be done. Like their ancestors and counterparts in Africa, most slave women took their motherhood seriously. They put the responsibilities for their children before their own safety and freedom, provided for children not their own, and gave love even to those babies born from violence. For their experience and knowledge as caregivers, elderly women were among the most respected slaves on southern plantations. For enslaved men, escape to freedom was the most promising opportunity for preserving masculine identity and individual humanity. For the slave women faced with being black and female, and the added burden of dependent children, womanhood was easier accomplished within the slave community. Some of the negative, radical, stereotypical labels or caricatures that have been noticeably recognized to African Americans in America spanning over a period of many years still exist to this day. They have been very damaging and disastrous to the social progress of blacks. The mammy was portrayed as being happy and contented in her role in life, which was ultimately to serve the whites until she died. In reality, many mammies were physically attractive black women whom the white man secretly lusted after and who could not wait until his wife was gone so he could either seduce her or force himself on her. Most mammies were young. In fact, most of them were barely made it past 50 years old. They were often literally worked to death. And also, contrary to popular opinion, mammies hated their miserable lot in life. The coon is one of the most offensive stereotypes ever inflicted on African Americans, especially black men. The term is derived from the animal, the raccoon. The term was used extensively, particularly from 1890 onward, when it was first introduced in a song that interestingly was written by an African American songwriter named Ernest Hogan, when he composed the song, "All Coons Look Alike to Me." The coon was depicted as a lazy, shiftless, do know-nothing black man who was easily frightened, inarticulate clown. Sambo wasn't any different than the coon. He tended to be more obedient, non-threatening, well-behaved, just the way the white man wanted him to be. He was only around for comic relief, or to serve as host to the white man and his guests. The Pickaninny, or Pics as they were called for short, were black children who were portrayed as younger versions of coons. They were often dressed in ragged clothing, or their hair was either nappy or braided. The Pickaninny caricature has contributed to the breakdown of the black community as portraying black children as being dirty, lazy, uneducated, nappy-headed kids who seem to have nothing better to do at their time but sing, dance, or get into trouble. The Jezebel and Sapphire was portrayed as sneaky, treacherous, scheming women. She was also a bossy, overbearing, loudmouth joker who was always verbally abusing and dominating her weak black husband. This negative stereotype has destroyed relationships between real-life black men and women influenced by such a negative stereotype. Like many of the dismal conditions that plague the black community, these stereotypes have been deeply rooted since American slavery. Black families were notoriously close-knit and extended well beyond immediate relatives. Communities as a whole would look out for and support one another in an effort to reach social and economic equality shortly after the Civil Rights Movement. Their efforts were reinforced when policymaker Daniel Patrick Moynihan issued a report addressing the unfortunate realities of life in inner cities for many African Americans. His report called for action against, among other things, unemployment. Moynihan recognized that even in families that were lucky enough to have a father figure, he could not find a job due to the radically biased capitalist economy. He also noted that in those families without a male presence, a single mother was rarely able to provide the discipline and economic means necessary to ensure success for her family. His ideas were very controversial due to the previously mentioned strength associated with African women. Ultimately, the Civil Rights Movement was not a finish line for social equality. Racism remained prevalent in American society, even directly affecting a family's ability to provide and succeed.